Hello, my name is Danielle Tong, and thank you so much for joining us for today's forum. We are excited to have Danny Robbins with us today. Danny is the Director of Nonprofit Administration Programs, which is a master's and a certificate program, and she's also the founder of Nonprofit Evolutions. Danny asked us not to go into a lot of blubber about her achievements and accomplishments, but I think it suffices to say that we are so excited to have her today. She is a very frank and honest speaker, just what we need on this topic, and we are so excited to hear from her. Before we get into the program today, I'd like to share a little bit of housekeeping with you today. First, we have the option for closed caption. If you look in the right-hand corner of the black bar at the bottom of your screen, you will see the option to click live transcript. And when you click that, you will see show subtitles. That will bring up the closed caption on your screen. If you'd like to change the size, you can choose subtitle setting, and you can adjust it to be larger or smaller. In addition, if the subtitles appear in the wrong area for your viewing on the screen, you can click those and drag them anywhere on your screen. That will help you view today. Secondly, I want to let you know that this session is being recorded. Audience members will not be seen today, only our panelists. But what that means for you is that you will be able to access this forum after it's over. If you've registered via Eventbrite, you will be able to get an email at whatever email address you use to register, which includes a link to this forum, the slides that are used today, and also a survey that helps us know how we're doing our jobs. Are we doing great? Could we do better? So please do take some time to fill out that survey after this is over. Finally, we use the Q&A box and the chat box a little differently than you may have experienced in other forums. The Q&A box is reserved for content questions. So if you have a question you want to ask Danny about her presentation or about the content you hear today, please go ahead and type it in the Q&A box. Monitor that box throughout the presentation for questions that you feel are interesting. You can upvote those questions so that I know those are a priority for you, things that you want to hear about. If you have technical issues with the webinar today, please leave those in the chat box. The chat box will not be monitored for content questions, but it will be monitored for technical assistance. So if you have any questions about how the webinar is flowing, any issues with closed captioning, for example, that's the place you put that. And with that, I am excited to turn it over to Danny.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. So I'm going to share my screen and we will jump on in. So this is a little bit about me. You could read about it later because I believe we're going to send the deck out. Suffice it to say, I've worked in nonprofits my entire career and I'm going to be 52 in a couple days. So it's a long time. So what I really want to talk about is storytelling, but it's going to take me a bit to get to storytelling. So please indulge me the time to paint the picture because there's a backdrop against which many of us work, but we don't always talk about. And I want to use that backdrop to illustrate the challenge of discussing work that's funded by donors, executed by staff on behalf of a third group families, and how that discussion has the potential to harm the people who we serve, the people who we intend to help. So let's talk about class. And for those of you who are my age, I know your brain was going somewhere else, but we're going to talk about class. We like to pretend we don't have a class system, except for when we want to describe groups, right? So what those of us who write grants, those of us who tell stories, we have to talk about the groups that we serve. And especially in groups that are served by agencies that work for justice, we get ourselves crosswise sometimes. So we have a philanthropic class that supports agencies that serve families in lower socioeconomic income groups or other marginalized groups, typically characterized as some version of the following: disadvantaged, living below the poverty level, poor, minority, which conflates race with class, which happens a lot, minoritized, or whatever your favorite pejorative adjective is. And the reality is that our boards and our leaders don't look like or have the same experiences as the people our agencies serve. this is one of my favorite quotes. The American philanthropic sector is one where, as Burton and Barnes so eloquently put it in the article, Shifting Philanthropy from Charity to Justice, quote, often well-intentioned people make decisions for communities they do not come from, may not understand, rarely interact with, and almost never set foot in. We really have to acknowledge the unacknowledged. Most of the social justice and social service agencies are funded by donors who have different experiences than nonprofit leaders, who have different experiences than the staff we lead, who may or may not have different experiences than the families we serve. On top of that, I want to layer two troubling foundations. I want to lay on top of that troubling foundation two theories. And they're theories that prop up our reality, but we don't generally talk about them when we talk about storytelling. But they're there in the background, shadowing the work. So those theories are the Bootstrap Theory and the theory of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And those are real theories. Those are real academic social science theories, and they are baked into our public policy. So the American dream is based on the Bootstrap Theory, right? Anyone can, and from anywhere, can come to America and pull themselves up by their bootstraps to make a better life. And is that real for many families? Yes. And I know some of you are out there saying, my grandma did that and my grandpa did that too. But it's interwoven with its less appreciated counterpart, privilege. And people often think privilege means freedom from struggle, but it doesn't. Every family has struggled and most people work hard. Privilege is the breaks you get or don't get along the way because of things that have nothing to do with you. Your dreams, your abilities, but have everything to do with what people see and perceive about you. The distinction is the obstacles placed in your path or removed from your path. It's the chances and the choices other people will give you or take away based on what they think about you that really has nothing to do with you at all. So on top of that theory is the theory of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? So I want you to take a minute to determine how, if you were in charge of the world and you made the rules, you would distinguish between who is deserving poor and who is undeserving poor. I'm going to give you a minute. Who would count as deserving poor and who would count as undeserving poor? With the acknowledgement that hopefully none of you would make these distinctions because they're not fair or honorable, but they're real, right? So from a public policy perspective, it's the why. It's what underlies the decision regarding whether a homeless veteran with a history of addiction and crime gets housing or whether the family who just got evicted because of medical bills gets housing. It's why we have a shelter and transitional housing system instead of a robust and available permanent housing system, which we're working on, but we're still haven't quite gotten where we want it to be. It is much less expensive, as we all know who work in this field, to create affordable housing than it is a three-layer system of shelters, transitional housing, and affordable housing, because each layer is staffed by staff, right? We work in these fields and we are working to move people into permanent homes, but we are working in a structure that is based on the foundations that we're talking about. So deserving and undeserving is about blame, which is how the Bootstrap Theory comes in. And the policies that follow in the wake of these two theories set up the families we serve to receive pity, but not empathy, help, but not respect, services, but not dignity. It's not just poverty and bootstraps and the judgment of others who haven't walked in their shoes, but who have likely absorbed both theories, even as they may not be able to articulate either. So one of the things I always talk about with my students is what's the goal and who decides, right? So are there groups who are more deserving and groups who are less deserving? Should that determine who gets services and who doesn't? Does it impact who gets the house and who doesn't? And I got to tell you, and I know you all know this, it does. The delineation between the deserving and the undeserving poor requires the creation of extensive and expensive bureaucracy to make sure that the poor don't take advantage of a system ostensibly designed to help them. And even though we've created this structure, it costs multiple times more than to fund what people actually need, which we're still funding in part, but with less resources and appreciably less dignity. So most of the services for those in need are set up on the assumption that people cheat. And if you don't believe me, I invite you to consider how often we give people cash. There's been multiple studies that prove that giving people cash, they will most likely take care of their basic needs. But we don't give people cash. Why? Because we've created bureaucracies to make sure that people prove they need assistance. We insist people prostrate themselves to defend their needs and jump through arbitrary hoops to get assistance. And I believe in everything, not just this situation, in everything, some subset of a population will find a way to take advantage of any system we create. That doesn't mean we build systems that alienate the many to protect the few. We could, and I believe we should, set up systems to mitigate cheating while affirming dignity. So where we are today, the two ways of framing the world sets up our agencies to tell unflattering stories about the deficits of our families, or worse, exploitive ones to pull at the heartstrings of donors, to make them feel good about their I can never say this word, magnanimity, maybe, while illustrating that donors and recipients are not the same. There are people you can help, but they're not your people. They're fundamentally different. There's them and there's us. Us who have worked hard, who deserve where we landed and can now give back to those who didn't. It is an inaccurate story. So I want to, like, what set me down this path was a letter. Literally, I got a letter that said, and it wasn't even a letter asking for money. It was a letter to write a kid a letter. So it was a letter, it was an invitation to write a kid a letter. And in the letter, it said that many of the children they serve have, among other things, a lack of role models. So you know that emoji where your head explodes? That's what happened in my house. Now, I will tell you, you may have received those letters and you may have written some of those letters, but I want you to think about, what stories do those letters tell? Are they exploitive? Are they accurate? Are they necessary? And ponder for a minute. Do you think kids from families with less resources have a lack of role models? What about middle-class kids, affluent kids? So we're telling a story that isn't even real, right? Kids from families of all resources have different opportunities and different access to role models. Does a family's wealth or lack of wealth correlate to the number or the quality of role models available? Does that story honor the dignity of the families that organization serves? Is it even true? I have to tell you, I know that agency pretty well, and it's not true. And if that letter was even the only one, but I get letters like that all the time. I might have even written some of them. I mean, as I started, I've been in this field for 30 years, right? So it's been a journey and we've all learned a lot of mistakes along the way, and I have learned them all the hard way. So it is very possible I might have written some of them before I understood and could articulate the difference between honoring the families we serve and not. And maybe you have too. But it's not even just us, right? It's not just donors and donor outreach and staff. Sometimes people call us with requests that seem benign, but are not benign at all. I once got a call from a woman who wanted to bring her kids down to my organization to see how the other half lives. That's actually what she said. I was like, why do you want to bring your kids down to this organization? She's like, I want them to see how other people live. Well, absolutely not under any circumstances, but right. But what and I could have engaged this woman and I could have, done a lot of things that might have been, frankly, nicer and maybe kinder. But what I did was tell her that a trip to another community is not a trip to the zoo. And it was a teachable moment for me. And if those of you who know me in the audience, I try to never miss a teachable moment. A trip to another community is not a trip to the zoo, and we cannot abide people thinking that it is, and that's a reasonable request. So what if I had let her though? What would that have taught that woman or her kids? Or more importantly, and who I'm more care about what they think of me, the people that I had the honor and the privilege of serving. What if a family had seen the don't have good role models letter? Many of our families are doing the very best they can for their kids and would be appalled if they saw that letter or saw that somebody was there to see how they live. It's both disrespectful, but it's also alienating to our donors, right? I got the letter. Do you think I wrote those people a check? No, I picked up the phone. I picked up the phone and I said, look, you can't send letters like this. They're disrespectful. You're telling a story that isn't accurate. You can't do this. So I want you to think about what you would do, because you get those letters too. donors aren't going to call us, other than me, for the most part. They're not going to call us and say they're offended by our letters. They're just going to stop supporting us. We can't afford that. We have too much work to do. So how else does it happen? We ask clients if we can use their stories. Sometimes our clients are really grateful for the service we provide, and they tell us that, and we may ask if we can share their stories. But we don't always consider if they feel obligated to say yes. If we're being coercive, there are some fields, the American Psychological Society, that's Psychology Society Association, whatever they're called, they have a very, very high bar, or low bar, I guess, for what counts as coercive, and they would consider that request to be coercive. What happens to the family afterwards? Most of our communities are not that big, right? Even the big cities are not that big. So what happens if somebody's story gets out and people learn about it? What happens to that family? What price did they pay later after we've already gotten the donations in and we've moved on as an organization? So sometimes we do it like that. We ask clients if we can use their stories. Sometimes we make up an amalgamation of stories, which could be better, but also could be worse, right? Because if we take one person's story, that's one person's story. If we take 3 people's story or 5 people's story, right, we are telling a terrible story that may be worse than the stories that our families are already living. And then, as my good friend Tasha Booker likes to say, we tell triumph over tragedy stories. And if you don't know Tasha Booker, she's brilliant and is the most recent former executive director of City Year Columbus and is now a senior vice president at City Year National. And triumph over tragedy stories set up our families as success is the exception, not the rule. So we're lowering the bar on behalf of our families by telling those stories. So what else could we do? Because I know, right? You pick up the newspaper, what's the first thing it starts with? A story. You pick up a letter from a nonprofit, first thing it starts with, a story. I know this flies in the face of current storytelling mantras, but we're the leaders of our community and we have power. So I want you to think about what else we could do. We could ask questions. Imagine if, when I used to run domestic violence shelters, we used to write letters. Imagine if you could no longer stay in your house. Imagine if you had to live on whatever money was in your wallet because you had to leave your house immediately. Imagine if it wasn't safe in your house and you had to figure out what to do with you, how to protect your children. Imagine. We could ask our donors what they want to see and explain why we're asking. We can tell asset-based stories, but we have to consider the messaging in our messages. So this is from Boys and Girls Clubs of America's Guide to Effective Strength-Based Messaging, which was developed by Proper Strategies. So they are recommending messaging do's. When you finished, ask yourself the following questions to determine if your language is strength-based, right? Does my message empower and recognize the ability of youth or whomever you serve, whatever group you serve, to overcome obstacles and shape their futures? Do you put stats and the challenges people face in the context of systemic inequities and social conditions? Do you center youth voice and highlight individual lived experiences? Do you focus on the strength of the communities your families come from and live in, right? That's asset-based. Do you use facts when describing challenges? Do you acknowledge that your organization, and for those of you who read Board Source, this is actually part of what we're all talking about, at the board level too, of where our organizations fit in a broader ecosystem. So do you acknowledge that your organization is part of a broader ecosystem of support that families and communities play a role in helping youth achieve their goals? Do you put the needs of your kids in the context of what all kids need to be successful, right? Do only kids from lower resource families need role models? Are they the only ones that don't have role models? Do you use first person language? Do you emphasize that when young people achieve their goals, it benefits all of us? So here's what you shouldn't do. And here's a way to decide if you're not doing it. When you've finished writing, ask yourself the following questions to avoid stereotypical messaging. So remember my pejorative words where we started? Does my message define people by their circumstances? Are they poor kids or kids from lower resource families? Do we focus on the weaknesses and problems? Do we frame the need as individual weaknesses? One of my colleagues in the field always says individual solutions for systemic problems, right? Do we focus on changing people? Do you position your kids and donors as heroes, lifesavers, or lifesavers, saviors or lifesavers? Do you incorporate coded language that perpetuates systemic inequities, like dangerous neighborhood or inner city? Do you use vague details about poor behavior, criminal behavior, or situations of violence? And if you've answered yes to any of these, I invite you to explore how you could rework the piece to adopt a more strength-based approach. And if you're unsure, consider discussing with a colleague or a professional communicator. I also want you to consider how our families would react to our letters. You know, for some of our sectors, the families are the clients, right? The donors are the clients. But for other sectors, the donors are in one world and the clients are in another world, and rarely do those worlds overlap. So I want you to think about it. What if we talked about hopes? What if we, and their hopes, not just what our agencies need, right? But what our people need. What are their hopes? What are their dreams? What assets do they bring to the table? And do it all, please, with an equity lens. And talk about equity. So what the letter could have said: every child needs role models, and different children need different role models. Every community has role models, and every one of them matter. We are part of building a village to protect and help raise our community's children. I want you to tread carefully, and I said earlier that I try to never miss a teachable moment. So there's 113 people on this call. If you are in a leadership position and you are a different faith, gender, or race than the majority of the families your agency serve, or if you are joining our sector from the business or the government sector, I implore you to tread carefully. We can never be perceived as exploiting the people our organizations exist to serve. It's disrespectful to them, and it's destructive to our organizations. So moving forward, I invite you to read How Can Nonprofits Move from Exploitive Storytelling to Justice-Oriented Storytelling by Dr. Deborah Jenkins. She said, and I quote, "I encourage those who gather stories for the purpose of fundraising to think about the stories as vibrant snapshots gifted, providing a rare glimpse into the in-depth day-to-day lives of people. Stories may be told through words, pictures, observations, actions, or behaviors. I had to learn that regardless of how the story is told, I, as a story gatherer and story gatekeeper, must always ask, am I really listening for an authentic voice and power of the storyteller, or am I focusing only on the portion of the story that could benefit the nonprofit?" So I'll take you back to my earlier question. What's the goal and who decides? We decide. We are the leaders of our community, so we need to be clear on what our goals are and how we're honoring the people that we serve. And I'm asking you to make this commitment. We cannot, we should not, and please join me in saying we will not exploit our families to engage our donors. It's not acceptable, it's not reasonable, it's also not necessary. It complicates our ability as social justice and nonprofit leaders to honor the people in our communities and their lives. And it is critically important that the messaging we use does not reinforce either the bootstrap theory or the theory of the deserving and the undeserving poor. Donor love doesn't equal client respect. And I know there's a lot of fundraisers out there who are very big on donor first, but I am not one of those fundraisers out there. I believe in mission first and mission always, and they're not necessarily in conflict, but I think when we have to make choices, we pick the mission first and the clients first. I want you to embrace your donors, but I don't ever want you to forget that we don't exist to serve those donors. And I've done it, which is how I know, because again, I told you I'd learn all my lessons the hard way. So I once had an agency that we had just built a new building, and it was new and beautiful, and I was so proud of it. And we had a donor coming, and the floor needed to be vacuumed, and the floor, I should have said the floor needs to be vacuumed because we have kids here, and the kids, you know, should have a floor that's vacuumed. But instead, I made the mistake of saying we need to have this floor vacuumed because our donor is coming, right? So I made it donor first, but I was wrong. Donor first is not the right way to go. Mission first, kids first, whoever your organization first, them. We serve to serve our families. We should engage our donors and invite them to partner with us to make our communities better, but we exist to improve our communities. The mission and those we serve must always be our primary focus. those of us who work for justice can't contribute to the narrative that there's a deserving poor and an undeserving poor. We can't reinforce the bootstrap theory. We can talk to our donors about the difference between theory and reality and about how we can build on the assets our communities already have. We can hold those assets up as being worthy and deserving, because to do anything less is unjust. We have to tell stories that honor the dignity of our families and embrace our donors as we work together toward creating a more equitable and just world for all. Thank you. If you would put on your final words in the chat, I'm going to stop sharing and we can go back to all of us. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for that. I've been getting pings and emails and a lot of great feedback about how people are enjoying this session. I enjoyed this session. We have some questions in the Q&A box, and I'll start with those. If you find that you have more questions as we go on and throw those in the Q&A box. I also have questions. I wrote them all down. I won't lead with mine. I'll go with the ones in the Q&A box first. Well, we have some folks thanking you. So thank you for calling out the practices that dishonor people. Then one of the questions we have is, how do you deal with the realities of substance abuse and the justice system involvement without dishonoring the person or their experiences? We had a similar question come up around what kind of terminology do you use in order to describe demographics or tell truthful stories without dishonoring the people that you're working with?
Right, those are great questions. And you can see, I mean, if you look at City Year and Boys and Girls Clubs of America, they both actually engaged national communication firms to help them come up with the right language. So I think that's out there. I think you could also, get your team together on site and maybe bring some families in if that's appropriate, or the people that you serve, to really talk through how do you, anytime we're talking about how we're identifying people, always easiest to ask those people. How do you like to be identified? What's the most honest and accurate way we can do that while being respectful and honoring the assets you bring to the table in the community? I'm not quite sure that answers the question, Danielle. Does it?
I think that does. And if it doesn't, folks in the audience, please let me know. But you bring up a good point about really involving the folks that you're working with and making this a two-way street of communications. We should never be talking about someone. We should be talking with someone and involving them in the conversation, particularly when there is a power dynamic involved, which I would like to ask a question about if we have time.
Yeah, but before we move on to the next question, one of the things that I really believe is to not do for people without people, right? So if we're going to create some story, we need to involve the people whose story we're telling, to make sure that they're okay with the story that we're telling. But I never believe we should do for a community without that community.
Yes, I agree with that. We also have another question that asks, what is your opinion on having youth write thank yous to donors? And I would like to broaden this a bit around the concept of sending pictures and notes and having folks involved in the thank you process. Where do we walk the line of exploitation?
Right. It's a really good question, and I don't know that I can answer it by field. I will tell you that I have run agencies that we had kids call people, and the kids loved it and the board members loved it, but I'm not so sure the parents loved it, and honestly, I'm not even sure we asked them. So that would be a good lesson for all of us of whose permission are we getting before we're doing things, and is that enough, right? Because even though the kids loved it and the donors loved it, we should have been checking with the parents, and it very well may be that we did, and I just don't know that. But we should be doing that if we're not doing that.
Absolutely. I just wanted to say quickly, going back to one of the questions we just answered, that I really loved the idea you had about asking folks and being intentional about having a focus group to say, in our marketing materials, how would you like people to understand you? and gathering all that up in advance so that you have it as a tool for your disposal in the future. We have another question that says, is it fair to highlight how lives have been changed through your program by asking in an interview, how do they see their lives going if it weren't in the program? So providing a pre and post conceptual concept for donors. Would that be?
I think we have to do that to prove impact. The question is, do we have to then use that in our storytelling? And if we're going to, how are we disclosing to the clients that we will, and what kind of permissions are we getting? Right. So I think we all walk lots of confidentiality lines. The question is where you're putting those lines and what kind of consent you're getting. Because if I fill out a form about a pre and a post test, I am not expecting that to end up in an ad, right? Or in marketing materials or in a letter. And if that is in one of those materials, there should have been not only consent, but permission and a whole lot of conversations that should have happened and hopefully did.
Okay, and we have another one that says, do you have a specific recommendations for applying storytelling to fundraising events, site tours, i.e. storytelling to a live audience versus written pieces?
Right, I think it's the same argument, right? Like, I think you're still trying to honor the people that you serve and to be careful with the stories that you tell. I don't think it's written or in person or, I don't know that any of that matters, but I think what matters is that you're involving the clients, you're getting their permission, and that you are clear that you're not telling, what Tasha calls triumph over tragedy stories, right? Because it's not honoring people's experience. Even if you want to celebrate their experience, it's still exploitive.
That brings us to another question in the chat box, and one that I had as well, is how do we reconcile the fact that the triumphs over tragedy stories really work? They do the job that they've
right.
been employed to do.
They totally do the job. And you're right. And they pull on everybody's heartstrings. And listen, like, my goal as a fundraiser is to make people write a check. And if I can make you cry, then you're more likely to write a check. And I know that. But that doesn't mean that I get to sell a bill of goods that is not accurate, right? Mm-hmm. So we just have to be careful and honorable in how we do things, and thoughtful, right? Like, one of the things I really believe about leadership is that it has to be intentional, strategic and intentional. So the more we can be intentional in the stories that we're telling and how they honor our clients, rather than, if I tell a triumph over tragedy story, and then either we're setting up the 99 people that doesn't apply to for people to think that they should be able to do that too, right? And fundraisers out there, I want you to think about how often you've been asked to come up with a what was the ice bucket challenge, right? Because one person did it, and then all of a sudden everyone was like, they did it, how come you can't do it? It's the same thing, right? So we don't want to set our clients up for for ice bucket challenge conversations if that's not a reasonable expectation. And triumph over tragedy, it's just, I don't know, I don't like the idea of it's like the trip to the zoo, right? I don't like the idea of showing somebody's pain so that you will feel good about who you are. Like, that doesn't feel honorable to me.
I think that what this says to me, the triumph over tragedy stories, it really plays into those theories that you discussed earlier, the Bootstrap Theory and the deserving versus undeserving core theories. So we can really, if we're using those, if we're employing those in our stories, it's playing to these theories that any person can kind of pull together their various resources and create this ideal type for themselves. How would you say that we then bring our donor base along for this ride with us, so that it's not just about us changing our stories, but then falling short of donor expectations, but we're also able to help the donors come along?
Right, and that's the really hard part right now, right? Because everyone is so careful And also like the lines are so despairing right now and divergent on what people believe and how we have those conversations. And, you know, people really like the bootstrap theory, right? Like I am not among those people, but like people have really, you know, like they really like the bootstrap theory and they really don't like having conversations about privilege. And, you know, how do you talk about that in that environment? But we have to, right? Because we can't continue to allow, you know, allow stories that are disrespectful to our clients or allow assumptions that are disrespectful to our families, right? The bootstrap theory works best, you know, in certain communities, and it works appreciably less well in other communities. And then when you add on, you know, the theory of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, and you add on systemic, you know, racism and other issues on top of it, you know, the bootstrap theory becomes, the bootstrap theory assumes everyone starts in the same place. And because we know that's not true, then we know that the expectation that you should be able to pull yourself up from your bootstraps is flawed, by definition, even though people love it.
Yeah. So we have a few questions about, I'm going to kind of roll them together to say about resources for exactly what language to use. For example, we often use undeserving or underserved. There it is. We often use underserved. And is that an appropriate word to use? Should there be others? And is there a true north resource for us to go to regarding language?
Right. Those are great questions. And you know, it's so funny that you said underserviced, because if you spell it wrong on your computer, or it used to be, I don't know if it still does this, but when I first started writing grants, if you know, when I got a computer, because I started writing grants right around the same time that we all finally got computers on our desks, it would change underserved to undeserved. And you always had to go back and make sure that it was right. So, you know, I think you have to get together with your people and come up with the right words, right? And it may be, and don't be afraid to call your colleagues in the field, right? There are some fields, we're sort of in this place in the field that there are still a lot of leaders who are very who don't share well, I can't think of the right word, but who are not as collaborative, right? Because they feel like they're more competitive, that's the right word. They feel like we're all competing against each other and that we can't come to the table to talk. But I would argue that that's not true, right? We might be competing occasionally, but for the most part, we're all rowing in the same direction. And social justice works best when we do it together. Right. So the difference, you know, social justice is really defined by, you know, us moving together to try to address systemic issues. And if we can get together with our colleagues and talk about the right language, you know, then we'll all be more likely to be going in the same direction and educating people as we go, which is really the goal, right? So not only are we working towards our community, we're educating the people outside of that community on the community's needs, but also the roadblocks that are in the community's way to be successful. So together is my answer.
Okay. Okay. So we have another question that says, when folks do have a triumph over tragedy story, they often are proud of themselves. They often understand themselves as perhaps not the norm, and therefore tend to tell their own story. And so the question is, how do you control for that is not exactly what this person is saying, but how do you not silence those voices, but make sure that there is a balance of messaging?
Right. So while you're talking about that, I'm thinking about, like, you know, every year we all see like 3 or 4 young African-American, you know, gifted students who were given full rides to Harvard and Yale, and right. And there's a long list of all the schools that they've gotten into. And that's awesome. And we want to celebrate that. But there's also an entire group of kids that are standing next to them that also got into Ohio State and Kent State and got full rides to whatever school they're going to, who we're not talking about. And we're doing a disservice to all of those kids who worked really hard too. So I would say the more we can tell more stories. Like if we're going to tell stories of triumph over tragedy, let's tell the kids stories that are additional to that, right? Like the kids that are standing next to them that also worked hard, that also did well, that also maybe, maybe their stories aren't as horrific, but they also achieved great things, and we want to support that. So it's hard, right? Like, and I don't even pretend to have all the answers. So, these are things that I'm trying to figure out too. And the best I can tell you is be as honorable as you can, as intentional as you can, and as with as much humility as you can, right? Because we're not going to get this right, and we're going to have to walk it back at some point. And we're going to have to learn the lesson and try to do better next time.
That is great. I think the fact that you're talking about humility is hugely important, because I think this process requires great humility for all of the folks involved, and keeping that central to the editing. One of our comments mentioned that their program goes through multiple rewrites. They ask themselves multiple questions around, if a parent or child were reading this, how would they feel? How would they feel about their challenges being described? And then they get out the red pen and they rework it, which requires holding that humility central. I have a question about in the very beginning of your presentation, you discussed the donors, which may have a different experience than the nonprofit leaders, which may have a different experience than the client base. And can you talk a little bit about the power dynamics that exist in these roles, and how that then affects messaging and outcomes, et cetera?
Absolutely. Well, maybe. The first part, definitely. The second part, maybe. So, right. I mean, the vast majority of our boards are still white, right? The vast majority of our leadership is still white. The vast majority of our large organizations are run by white men. The next layer of organizations are run by white women, and then we are still struggling with diversifying our senior leadership and our boards, and because of that, we are not reflective of the people we serve, or sometimes our own values. Right. So we're talking about diversity, but we're not living diversity. So I think a lot of it is, the more intentional we can be, the more thoughtful we can be, the more we can really recruit a wide variety of people to all of our roles, and not just sort of shrug our shoulders and go, well, we put it out there and this is who applied. Well, sure, that's great, but do some more work and get some more people in your pool, because we can't do what we've always done to get anywhere different than where we are. And if we don't like where we are, we're going to have to start making different choices. So that, but I think the more we can bring, and I love the idea of getting out the red pen and handing it to your families and handing it to your, like, we have to talk to people, and we have to be comfortable having uncomfortable conversations, and we have to put things on the table that people might not want to hear, right? Because that's how things change. And until things change, we're just going to have to be more bold and, and maybe scared, but doing it anyway. You're muted, Danielle.
Thanks. I had a bunch of alerts. I was trying to keep those out of the conversation. In line with diversifying the leadership of the board, can you talk a little bit about how you think that diversity, or lack thereof, will drive a message? Because we've talked a lot about donors, and we've talked a lot about development staff, and there's this centerpiece of folks that are board leadership, which are not necessarily always diverse, may not actually, be the client population that you're working with, and may not understand that the development staff needs to send another message. How do you bring your board along? That's question number one. And question number two is, what are your thoughts on having board seats that are dedicated to having clients sit there?
Now you're real. Okay, I'm going to start with that one. So, and actually they're part of the same conversation. So I really believe in generative governance, and BoardSource has been talking recently about purpose-driven boards, and that too, which is really the other side of generative governance, or just a different framing of generative governance. And I actually, if maybe you'll invite me back to do this, because I have an entire thing on board governance and how you build the right board, and how you weave in generative governance and purpose-driven board leadership. But so the answer to your question, how do I feel about having clients on the board? I feel like most people don't do it. Most organizations don't do it well, and it ends up being alienating and lonely for the people who do it, who are in it. And I think you have to do everything for the right reasons. And sometimes people want to do it, but then they don't want them to do other things, or they create second-class citizens of board leadership, and I never want us to do that. I also don't know that you can't accomplish what you want a different way, right? So I'm a big advocate of having client councils, family councils, kid councils, whoever's on the council, but groups of people who you get feedback from, but don't necessarily need a board seat, unless they need a board seat, right? If it makes sense, it makes sense, but it doesn't always make sense. And I want you to, I don't want us to create people feeling uncomfortable and disrespected because we weren't honoring, their needs, our needs. I've seen too many organizations do it poorly clients on the board. I get the intention behind it, but it ends up creating two layers of citizenship, and I think you shoot yourself in the foot at that point. Like, if we can't do it well, I'd rather we did something else. But I like client councils or family councils or whatever, because you want to make sure that we have somebody we're talking to check us, right? Yeah. We're out here saying this, like maybe we should not be out here saying this. So I think councils can get at that. And if you have clients who you will treat the same way as other board members, and honor the same way as other board members, and expect the same things from them as other board members, then by all means. But if you're not going to do that, then you shouldn't do it.
I think that is beautifully said, and the intention behind having a dedicated board seat is always there. But you're absolutely right about that alienating piece that can happen, or the different sets of expectations that can happen, or even the tokenizing of that client member that sits on that board unintentionally. So I'm just thinking about the damage that can happen to that one single person when they're introduced to a board that's just not ready to have that conversation yet. Right. So that makes a lot of sense. And I think the solution that you gave around a client and family advisory committee that can help inform decisions without necessarily subjecting them to other people's learnings. I think that's a brilliant and elegant solution to that problem. And it also gives organizations that pool that they can go to say, how would you like us to represent you in our literature, etc. Let's see.
And not only how you would like us to represent you, but can you please check our literature and let us know? But that also means that when we give something to somebody, back to the humility point, right? If I give you something to check and you bring it back to me and I argue with you on why you're wrong, right? Like, we're not getting anywhere. So I have to be willing to hear what you're saying, absorb what you're saying, and then change what you're asking me to change. And if you're not going to do that, then honestly, don't bother. Right? Because you never want to ask somebody for their opinion if you don't generally care about their opinion. And you're not going to change anything once they give you their opinion. That will just make it worse.
Absolutely. Always listen, always follow through once the question has been asked. If you're not going to do that, you'll lose your credibility pretty quickly.
Right. Which does not mean you're going to do everything people suggest, but you do want to go back and go, here's what I heard, here's what we're going to do, here's why.
All right, and our last question in the Q&A box is, can you talk about any new trends in donor engagement? And I think as pertains to this subject matter, is there any discussion around best practices for community engagement that honors clients? that essentially, to me, pulls the power dynamic back into the order where it should be.
I think just the fact that we're talking about it says that there is, and the fact that Boys and Girls Club and City Year have just invested in working with people to make sure that they're telling asset-based stories. I mean, those are the only two that I know of, right? But if there's two out there and I know of them, there's probably 20 out there that I don't know of, which I appreciate because I think it's work we should be doing, and I'm glad that they're doing it. So that's really what I'm seeing is organizations trying to move away from triumph over tragedy stories and trying to move towards asset-based, and not just in social justice work, but all over the place, right? Like people are trying to not do for communities without communities, for which I am very grateful, and I really applaud that. So I think you're just starting to see it, but I think you're going to see it a lot more, and I'm excited about that.
All right, well, that wraps up the last of our questions in the Q&A box, and I have had all my personal questions satisfied by this. Thank you so much. Actually, we got another one. Can you elaborate somewhere about asset-based storytelling, or where can we find some good examples?
Sure, and if you go back to the slides, and I think we're going to send them out, Danielle, but if you go back to the slides, you know, the idea of asset-based storytelling rather than deficit-based storytelling is how you're framing the conversation. So it's about like what's happening that's good in this community and how we can build on that rather than what's wrong with this community and how they need us to come in and fix it for them. So it really is about like engaging people in the work and also honoring the good work that's already been doing. But I think if you Google asset-based storytelling, you'll find some good stuff. And then the Boys and Girls Club and City Year things that we mentioned are in the deck, so you can see that. And I suspect the organization that they worked with probably has a website with lots of stuff on it, though I haven't looked.
Thank you. So that actually wraps up the final question for today. Thank you so much for all of the information that you shared. As you said, this is just a budding conversation that we hope to continue to spur. I'm excited that we were able to have you here, and I'm really grateful to everyone that joined us on the call today. You were a part of this conversation, and that means a lot. So I'm really appreciative for your time. Please do keep an eye on your inboxes after this is over. You'll have a link to the video in case you were wanting to watch or share with other folks. You'll also have a copy of the slide deck, and there will be that link to the survey. So we really want to hear from you about how you felt about this forum and what you want to see in future forums. And with that, I will wish you a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us.